The girl held her backpack with both hands and said nothing. She was 6 years old, her hair tied in a crooked ponytail that her father had done that morning, and eyes that observed everything with a seriousness that didn't match her age. When the glass doors of the building opened in front of them, she simply tightened her grip on her father's fingers and walked in with him. No one at the reception expected to see a child there. The Veltra security selection process was known in the city for being brutal, not in a metaphorical sense, in a literal sense. The company outsourced protection for high-risk executives, and the candidates who showed up usually had some combination of neck tattoos, military background, and the kind of look that made waiters switch tables. That was the environment. That was the standard. And then Elias Corro showed up. 38 years old, pants worn thin at the knees, a jacket that had clearly seen better days. He didn't look like a candidate. He looked like someone who had walked into the wrong building. And the child by his side, his daughter, presumably, only made the impression he gave worse. The receptionist looked at him, then at the girl, then at him again. "Are you sure this is the place?" "Yes," he replied, without irritation, without hurry. "Elias Corro. I have an interview at 10. She checked the list with a slowness that wasn't carelessness. It was judgment. "You can sit." The waiting room had about 12 people. Most fell silent when Elias walked in with the girl, but the silence didn't last long. A man sitting near the window, huge, with a neck wider than Elias's head, let out a short laugh. It wasn't subtle. "Brought backup," he said, looking at the child. Some laughed. Others looked away, the kind of people who don't participate, but also don't interrupt. Elias didn't respond. He took 2 chairs, helped his daughter sit, took a colorful book out of her backpack, and placed it on her lap. Then he sat beside her, clasped his hands, and stayed quiet. The girl's name was Iris, and Iris knew that situation. She had been in rooms like that before. Rooms where people looked at her father with that specific expression, a mix of pity and disdain that she still didn't have words to describe, but recognized in her body. She opened the book and pretended to read. The man by the window was named Roderick Payne, a former professional fighter, 2 meters tall. He had worked security for 3 governors and an oil magnate. He was, by any reasonable metric, the strongest candidate in the room, and he knew it. Everyone knew it. He was the kind of man who occupies space not only physically, but atmospherically. When he spoke, conversations around him diminished. When he walked, people moved aside without noticing. He looked at Elias once more, with the expression of someone cataloging something irrelevant. "Seriously, man, this isn't a place for a kid. She's not bothering anyone," Elias said, still without looking up. "I'm saying it for her own good." Roderick leaned slightly forward. "When the tests start, the atmosphere here is going to change. You won't have left before that." Elias finally looked at him. It wasn't a long look. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But there was something in that look that made Roderick step back imperceptibly, not out of fear exactly, but with the animal instinct of someone who realizes they've just misjudged something. The conversation died there. What no one in that room knew, and what Elias had no intention of telling, was the real reason he needed that job. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't adrenaline. It was a date. In 42 days, the lease on the apartment where he lived with Iris would expire, and the landlord had already said he wouldn't renew it. Elias had savings for 1 more month. That was all. Iris didn't know any of that. She was 6 years old and believed her father solved everything. And maybe she was right. But Elias carried that weight the way parents carry the things they don't say out loud, in the silence between words, in the stiffness of his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. At 10:02, a woman opened the door to the room and called the first name. It wasn't his. Elias took a deep breath, looked at Iris, and she lifted her eyes from the book for a second, just 1 second, and gave a tiny smile, the kind that doesn't need context. He was ready. If you're enjoying this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell in the comments what you think, and which city or country you're watching from. It means a lot. The first test wasn't physical. It was a small room with no windows, a table, and 3 evaluators who didn't introduce themselves. In front of each candidate, they placed a folder with photos, reports, and a simple question. Identify the 3 biggest risks in this scenario. The scenario was a corporate reception. Aerial photo, floor plan map, guest list, event schedule. Roderick took 11 minutes. He pointed out the entry points, mentioned the lack of cameras in the east corridor, and suggested reinforcement at the side exit. It was a competent answer. The evaluators took notes without expression. Elias took 3 minutes. But they weren't 3 rushed minutes. They were 3 minutes of someone who didn't need more time because he had already seen what he needed to see. He pointed out the same entry points as Roderick, but went further. He identified on the guest list 2 names with a history of lawsuits against the host company. Noticed that the event time coincided with the internal security shift change, and observed that the aerial photo had been taken in late afternoon light, which created a specific blind spot at the main entrance that didn't appear on the floor plans. One of the evaluators stopped writing. "How did you identify the blind spot?" he asked. "The shadow of the neighboring building in the lower right corner of the photo. In nighttime events, that area is left without natural lighting, and the nearest camera has an insufficient field of view to compensate." Silence. "Have you worked in risk analysis before?" "I've worked with other things," Elias replied, and did not finish the sentence. No one pressed. There was something in his tone that didn't invite continuation. It wasn't hostility. It was simply a very clear boundary, the kind experience people recognize and respect. Back in the waiting room, Roderick studied Elias with a different kind of attention than before. The mockery had disappeared. In its place was something more calculated, colder. Roderick was many things, but not stupid, and he had enough experience to know that candidates who leave evaluation rooms and leave examiners in silence are not ordinary candidates. "What field did you come from?" he asked directly. "Private," Elias said. "Private is vague." "It is." Roderick tilted his head. "Are you testing me, or are you naturally annoying?" The first thing that resembled genuine humor crossed Elias's face. Not a full smile, just a slight relaxation at the corners of his mouth. "Neither. I just don't like questions whose real purpose is something else." Roderick stayed quiet for a moment. Then he let out a short laugh and lowered his guard a few millimeters, the equivalent, in that man, of a long handshake. Iris was drawing in a small notebook that Elias had taken from her backpack. She had a specific talent for disappearing into any environment. Not in a sad way, but in a serene way, as if the world around her were just scenery, and she was perfectly comfortable with that. One of the reception assistants had brought her a glass of juice without anyone asking. Iris had said thank you with a formality that made the woman smile for a disproportionately long time. The second test was physical. It wasn't a fight. It was control. The candidates had to immobilize an articulated mannequin simulating active resistance, using the fewest movements possible. The score was calculated by efficiency, not strength. Maximum time, 45 seconds. Roderick did it in 12. Clean, direct, technical. The room approved with murmurs. When Elias stepped in, someone in the room commented in a low enough voice to be heard. "This one's going to take the full 45 and still ask for more time." He did it in 4 seconds. Not with violence. With geometry. A lateral entry, redirection of weight, pressure applied at the exact point where the mannequin's balance was compromised. The movement was so economical it seemed simple. And it seemed simple in the same way a very sharp knife seems simple. The result was there before anyone understood what had happened. The man who had made the comment said nothing else. One of the evaluators left the room for 3 minutes. When he returned, he whispered something to his colleague. The colleague looked at Elias, then went back to the notepad. Roderick watched all of this with the expression of someone who had just realized he was playing a game that wasn't quite what he thought it was. But there was one thing Elias still didn't know. The position being contested wasn't for a team. It was for a single, direct role, with no intermediaries. Personal protection for Veltra's CEO. And the CEO, at that moment, was on the other side of a one-way mirror observing each candidate since the beginning of the morning. She had crossed out 12 names from the list. Elias's remained untouched. Veltra's CEO was named Renata Voss. She wasn't related to any of the candidates, hadn't inherited the company, and hadn't gotten where she was by chance. She had built Veltra from scratch at 31, after leaving a corporate security consulting firm where she was the only woman in the room and the smartest person no one listened to. 15 years later, the company that had ignored her was her client. Renata had a habit of evaluating people based on the details they didn't control. Not the handshake, not the rehearsed posture, not the prepared answer to the difficult question. She observed what people did when they thought they weren't being evaluated. Elias, throughout the entire morning, had done exactly 3 things in that interval. He discreetly checked all the exits of the room as soon as he entered, positioned Iris's chair so that the girl sat with her back to the wall and a view of the door, and never, at any moment, took his attention off the environment for more than a few seconds at a time. He didn't do it performatively. He did it the way someone breathes. Renata had seen that once before, in a man who had spent years in operations she didn't have clearance to ask about. That man had retired early and disappeared. Elias Corro had something similar, not identical, but from the same family. She asked the assistant to pull his background before lunch. The background had gaps. Specific gaps, the kind that don't happen by accident. They happen when someone, at some point, signed documents that remove entire periods of a life from the public record. 6 years blank. After that, nothing but small jobs, temporary contracts, and the record of adopting a child named Iris 3 years ago. Renata stared at that document longer than she intended. The third test was the last of the day, and no one had warned that it would be different from the others. The remaining candidates, now 8, after 4 had been dismissed throughout the morning, were taken to a larger room. In the center, there was an area marked off with tape on the floor. An instructor explained the rules with the economy of words of someone who had repeated it many times. Controlled combat. No strikes to the head. The objective was to bring the opponent down or force them out of the area. Maximum duration of 90 seconds per round. Roderick crossed his arms and looked at the area with the expression of someone contemplating something too easy to be interesting. The first 3 matchups were quick. None lasted more than 40 seconds. Roderick brought down the 2 men he faced with an efficiency that was almost boring, and the third candidate gave up before completing the first round. Then the instructor called Elias. Iris was outside the room, with the reception assistant who had brought the juice earlier. Elias had asked this without drama, just leaned slightly toward the woman and asked if she could stay with the girl for a few minutes. The assistant said yes, before even finishing processing the request. Inside the room, when Elias walked toward the marked area, the atmosphere changed in a way that was hard to describe. There was no explicit hostility. There was anticipation, the kind that comes before something everyone has already decided will happen. The narrative was already written in everyone's mind. Roderick was the immovable one. Elias was the temporary obstacle, and the outcome was a formality. Roderick stepped into the area and stood still, his arms slightly away from his body. "You don't need this," he said, with a sincerity that was almost kindness. "You already passed the other tests. You can walk away, and no one will think less of you." Elias looked at him. "Thank you," and didn't leave. Roderick sighed. "All right." The instructor gave the signal. What happened in the next 6 seconds would be described differently by everyone in the room, because no one managed to fully follow it. Roderick advanced with the same weight he had used all morning, the same one that had worked the entire time, and met air. Elias had shifted laterally at an angle that wasn't expected, and Roderick's repositioning to compensate created exactly the opening Elias needed. A pressure on the shoulder, an imbalance at the hip, and Roderick was out of the area before he understood what had happened. 6 seconds. No one in the room spoke for a full moment. Roderick stood where he had landed, looking at the floor, processing. Then he lifted his eyes to Elias with an expression that was neither anger nor humiliation. It was recognition, the rare kind, that only appears in people who genuinely respect competence, even when it defeats them. On the other side of the glass, Renata Voss had already made her decision. But there was one piece of information that had not yet reached her. Something the assistant would find in the report only the next morning, and that would change the weight of everything she thought she knew about the man she had just hired. Elias started on Monday. There was no ceremony, no formal introduction to the team. Renata simply placed him where he needed to be, beside her, and the rest of the company adjusted to this new reality the way water finds its level. The internal team didn't like it. Not openly, but there was a silent resistance, the kind that shows up in hallways that become slightly emptier when you walk through, in conversations that pause a second longer than they should when you enter a room. Elias noticed all of it and reacted to none of it. He had learned, at some point in his life, that didn't exist in any document. That silent resistance is information. You don't fight information. You file it. The man who coordinated Veltra's internal security was named Dario Mank. 52 years old, 23 within the company. The kind of employee who knows where all the skeletons are because he helped bury half of them. Dario had been waiting for the promotion to head of security for 6 years. He had been passed over twice. When Renata brought Elias from outside, Dario smiled at the introduction meeting with a cordiality so precise it was almost a work of art. Elias returned the smile and filed it. In the third week, Renata received a proposal. A group of investors led by a man named Conrad Rice wanted to acquire 40% of Veltra through a deal that, on the surface, seemed advantageous. Immediate capital, international expansion, access to markets the company had not yet reached. The contract had 97 pages and had been delivered with a 48-hour deadline for signature. Renata was good at many things. Reading 97-page contracts in 48 hours while running a company wasn't impossible for her, but Conrad knew that. And that was why he had chosen that specific window, in a week when Renata had 3 international meetings, a crisis with a client in Dubai, and a pending internal audit. She handed the contract to legal. Legal said they needed 5 days. Conrad called personally to say the deadline was non-negotiable. Elias was in the room when that call happened. He said nothing during it. After Renata hung up, he remained silent for a few seconds. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's processing. "Have you seen the contract?" he asked. "Parts of it." Clause 34 allows the investor group to appoint a representative to the board with veto power over operational decisions above a certain amount. The amount is defined in an appendix that wasn't in the document they gave you. Renata went still. "How do you know there's an appendix?" "Because Clause 34 references Appendix F, and the document they gave you only goes up to Appendix C. What happened in the following hours was fast and non-linear, the way real crises happen. Not in an orderly sequence, but in simultaneous layers that demand parallel attention." Renata canceled the day's meetings. Legal was activated with maximum priority, and Elias, who had spent the previous 3 weeks quietly mapping every person and every system within Veltra, started pulling threads. The first thread led to the second. The second led to Dario Mank. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Server access logs at off hours. An email forwarded to an external address that didn't belong to any registered client. A meeting Dario had scheduled in the system as internal alignment on a date when Conrad Rice was in the city. Elias laid all of this on Renata's table at 11 at night, without adjectives, without interpretation. Just the facts, organized in a sequence that spoke for itself. Renata read everything twice. Then she stared at the window for a long moment. How long did it take you to put this together? I started in the first week. She turned to him. You knew since the first week? I suspected. There were patterns that didn't make sense if everyone was acting in good faith. I needed evidence before bringing it to you. Renata stayed quiet. There was something on her face that wasn't anger. It was the specific impact of discovering she had been vulnerable in a way she hadn't realized, protected by someone she had trusted without fully knowing why. Why didn't you tell me earlier that you suspected something? Elias considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because suspicion without proof only creates anxiety. You didn't need to carry that without me having something concrete to offer alongside it. Renata looked at him for a moment that went beyond the professional. At 6 the next morning, Dario Menk was met at the company entrance by 2 lawyers and an HR representative. Conrad Rice received a call from Renata, informing him that the proposal was being rejected and that Veltra reserved the right to report the irregularities identified in the process to the appropriate authorities. Conrad hung up without responding, and Appendix F was never mentioned again. For the next 3 days, Veltra was quiet in a different way. Not the tense silence of the previous weeks, full of unspoken things moving through the hallways like a cold draft. It was a silence of reorganization, the kind that happens after something that was crooked is finally straightened, and the people around need time to get used to the new geometry. Renata worked more than usual, if that was even possible. She reviewed every active contract, every system access, every position Dario had touched in the last 2 years. It wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. She had built that company brick by brick, and the idea that there had been a structural crack she hadn't seen bothered her in a way that went beyond the professional. Elias remained in the same place as always, by her side, silent, present, attentive. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Renata closed her computer earlier than usual, which, in her vocabulary, meant 7 in the evening instead of 10, and stared at the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold at least 40 minutes earlier. Can I ask you something? She said without turning. You can. Why did you need this job so much? She paused. Not the resume version, the real version. Elias stayed quiet for a few seconds. It wasn't the silence of someone deciding whether to lie. It was the silence of someone deciding how much truth was necessary. My daughter, he said. The apartment lease was ending in a few weeks. I had money for 1 more month. Renata turned to him. Did you walk into that selection with Iris because you had nowhere to leave her, or because you didn't want to leave her? Both. She considered that. Where is her mother? She isn't. There was no obvious bitterness in those 2 words. There was something harder than bitterness. There was acceptance, the kind that doesn't arrive suddenly but settles in over months and years until the pain doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Renata didn't press. She had learned, over the course of her life, that the heaviest stories are the ones people carry with the least drama. Iris had spent those weeks in a routine Elias had built with the same precision he applied to everything. In the morning, school 3 blocks from the office. In the afternoon, the reception assistant, who had asked on her own to stay with the girl on days when schedules didn't align, stayed with Iris until Elias finished. Renata had discovered this by accident when she passed by reception earlier on a Friday and found Iris sitting on the counter, teaching the assistant how to fold paper into a shape she had seen in a book. Neither of them had asked for permission. Neither of them had thought it necessary. Renata had stood at the entrance for a moment, watching that small, domestic scene in the middle of Veltra's corporate lobby, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. She only knew she didn't want to interrupt. On the Friday of the following week, Elias received his first paycheck. He stared at the amount on his phone for a few seconds, sitting on a bench in the hallway while waiting for Renata to finish a call. There was no euphoria. There was relief, which is something completely different. Euphoria is loud. Relief is the silence that comes after you put down something heavy you've been carrying for too long. He called Iris's school and confirmed her enrollment for the next semester. Then he called the apartment owner and paid 3 months in advance. Then he stayed quiet for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. There had been a version of his life, a few months earlier, in which that day seemed too far away to plan for. Now it was here, ordinary and concrete, and that was enough. On an October afternoon, Iris asked her father if Renato was their friend. Elias thought about the question more carefully than a child would probably expect. "Why do you ask?" "Because she asked how I was this morning. And it was real. Not the way people ask when they don't want to know." Elias looked at his daughter. 6 years old, hair tied in a crooked ponytail he had made that morning. The same seriousness in her eyes that didn't match her age, but that he had learned not to underestimate. "She is," he said. "I think so." Iris went back to the drawing she was making. Subject closed, the way only children can close subjects. Elias watched her for a moment. He had walked into that selection without being expected, without being taken seriously, carrying a child's backpack and a bank account that didn't add up. He had been the joke of the room before becoming the answer the room needed. And in the end, what had changed everything wasn't strength, wasn't background, wasn't any of the things people in that waiting room thought mattered. It was the choice to stay seated when everyone expected him to leave. Sometimes the only advantage you need is not walking away. If this story reached you somehow, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell in the comments what you think and which city or country you're watching from. Your presence here makes all the difference.